Welcome to the Three Things Podcast. I'm David Iglesias, Director of Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You may be wondering why this podcast is called Three Things. You were probably taught by your parents, like I was, that it was impolite to talk to people about three things: religion, politics, and money. But what happens if your job is to talk about those three things? Well, join me for the next 25 minutes and let's find out. So it's my pleasure today to welcome a friend of mine from many years ago, a former roommate and housemate of mine, who went on to do great things for the kingdom. Same as Dr Drevets. His brothers went to Wheaton College, his father went to Wheaton, his nephews and nieces went to Wheaton, so he knows our culture. Now, one of the many things that I've appreciated about Dr Drevets, is the fact that he has a specialty that is in high demand. He is a professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Oklahoma. He's been the chief section of infectious diseases at the Department of Medicine. He knows a lot about immunology. He has a diploma in tropical medicine and hygiene. And basically, I would say he is best described as an infectious disease doctor. So welcome to my show, Dr. Drevets. And we hope that this will shed a lot of light and answer some questions that folks may have.
Well, thanks, Dave. It's great to be here. And I really appreciate you inviting me to be on your podcast. It's quite an honor.
Well, thank you. So can you tell our folks why you became an infectious disease doctor? Out of all the fields you could have chosen, why this one?
You know, that's a great question. I guess I should back up and say, why did I choose to become a doctor first? And I am not making this up, but I must have been about 4 or 5 years old at the time. And I was watching the Kansas City Chiefs play football, and I wanted to be a professional football player. And I remember watching them on TV and thinking, those guys are awfully big. And I didn't even know they had shoulder pads on. I was that naive. And I looked at myself, I said, I'm not that big. I guess I'll be a doctor instead.
So being a doctor was plan B then? It
was plan B, and professional football, going into medicine. So I guess the real reason is ultimately I wanted to be like my father, and my father was a physician. So that's probably how I got there. Infectious diseases was interesting. So I graduated from medical school in 1984 and really did not have a great direction about a career option. I went into internal medicine, which is probably one of the broadest specialties that you can go into, because you can go into something that requires a lot of hands-on expertise like cardiology and is very invasive, to things such as what I do now, which is non-invasive. And when I was in my residency at Indiana University, I was trying to decide what did I want to do after graduation, and I was kind of programmed to specialize. And I had gone through what we call the Fellowship a Month Club, where 1 month you think you're going to do pulmonary medicine, another month you think you're going to do cardiology. And so finally I took a different tact, and I said, what do I want to be doing in 10 years? And that was the furthest I could think out from that time. And I thought, well, you know, I think I would like to be involved in tropical medicine and third world issues. And I got to there because at one time I had thought about going into medical missions. And so I said, well, I guess I'll go into infectious diseases, not knowing very much about it. And, you know, I grew up in Kansas, and as you know, I went to undergrad at Wheaton. So I always had this attraction to exotic places, and they had exotic diseases. And so I thought that would get me out of Kansas. So that's how I did that.
Well, thanks for sharing that. So, I mean, there must be thousands of diseases out there, including some in the tropics and some here in the temperate part of the world. And I'm sure you followed the spread of other epidemics. Can you share some other epidemics you have studied before the present COVID-19 pandemic?
Right. So the things that I've looked at over time kind of fall into two camps. One are diseases that are directly related to my research activities, and I've studied how bacteria invade the brain now for over almost 30 years now. And the particular bacteria I study is called Listeria monocytogenes, and it is a foodborne bacterium, and it causes outbreaks and epidemics. And so I will frequently be following any kind of an outbreak or epidemic caused by Listeria. In the US, the largest epidemic was a few years ago, and it was centered in a cantaloupe plant in southern Colorado, in the, I think the San Luis Valley. And from there, several hundred individuals became infected through cantaloupe. But a couple of years ago, it caused an outbreak in South Africa, and it was through these infected sausages, and thousands of people in South Africa were infected. So that's one thing that I do. The other thing that I do, other epidemics or outbreaks that I follow, are ones that impact my role as a faculty and at a medical school. And so, for example, when the swine flu came out in 2009, I was involved in our preparedness activities. I did quite a few lectures on that to Department of Medicine, College of Public Health. And so I studied that as well. And that helped me as I prepared for this pandemic, because I've been very involved in the university's preparedness plans for it. And so influenza and to a degree COVID-19 are similar in the sense that they're respiratory pathogens. So your plans are similar.
Gotcha. So what makes the spread of this virus different than, let's say, H1N1 and swine flu, like you mentioned, which have occurred just in recent years?
Yeah. So this one just goes really fast, and it does that for a couple of reasons. One is called pre-symptomatic spread, which means that people are more likely to spread this before they even know they're infected. So you could become infected on Monday, have symptoms of the disease on Saturday, which is about the average incubation time, but you're actually spreading the disease on Thursday and Friday. That's a little bit different than influenza, where you don't have so much pre-symptomatic spread. Another, I should say, characteristic of this that we found out is asymptomatic carriers. There's actually quite a large number of people who will get infected with this virus, never know they're infected, they never display symptoms, but yet they are more than likely competent to spread infection. The most recent modeling studies that I've found suggest on the low end that only on average 6% of all infections are detected, and on the high end maybe 16%. So there's a vast number of infections that are going undetected, and these are the ones that spread it. I think it was that pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic spread that really got healthcare workers involved or in trouble. Another thing that's different about this is it may have a component of what's called aerosol spread as opposed to being just by droplets. The classic diseases that are spread by aerosols are things like measles and tuberculosis. Influenza is classically a droplet spread. And there's probably an interface between them that this disease or this virus kind of trends a little bit more on the aerosol side, or at least has a little more of those components than strictly droplet.
So to help out us non-science types, the aerosolized transmission would be a lot smaller particles than the droplets. Is that correct?
You remember your basic biology very well. Yes, aerosol are smaller particles, and they tend to hang up in the air, and they stay up in the air for hours. Droplets are larger particles, and they settle out of the air on the environment. So if you sneeze, it's the droplets that you see covering your screen and your keyboard.
Right.
The aerosol would then stay up in the air for a while.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. Now, regarding asymptomatic carriers, would a historical example of that be Typhoid Mary from, I don't know, 100 plus years ago in New York?
Yes, that's actually a good analogy. Typhoid Mary was a cook, I believe, in New York City,
Yes.
And what we found out since typhoid Mary is that some folks who have chronic typhoid fever carry it on gallstones. It'll infect the gallstones, stay up in the gallbladder, and once it's there, you'll never get rid of it until you take the gallbladder out. I don't think that was known when typhoid Mary was around.
Right, right. Now, are you surprised at the rapid rate of transmission globally of COVID-19?
Yes, but I say that to my shame and embarrassment. You know, none of us should have been surprised at how fast this went. If you remember the great influenza in 1918, 1919, that started out, we think, in western Kansas, but globalized in a matter of months. And that was before air travel. That was all by rail cars and steamships. So the fact that COVID-19 globalized so rapidly is to a degree not surprising. And you've also seen that with things such as diseases such as Ebola. Although Ebola stayed concentrated in West Africa, it did jump the Atlantic Ocean and come to the U.S. So it can happen. And other diseases, mosquito-borne diseases such as dengue fever and Zika virus and West Nile have really gone worldwide in the last couple of decades. So it was fast. It was striking how fast it happened, but we shouldn't be surprised by that.
Now, I've seen some of the physicians on television talk about transmission, transmissibility, and whether it's communicable. Are those terms the same? Transmissibility, transmission, communicable, or are they different?
Yeah, so communicable is just, does it go from one person to another? Transmission is the event that happens. So if I'm infected and I'm sitting in a room having a meeting with you and you become infected, that's a transmission event. Transmissibility is some kind of an idea of how capable a virus is to spread, or a parasite or a germ is to spread. The transmissibility is quantified by a number that's called the R naught, or the R0 factor. And it's important to calculate that, because if that number is less than 1, then the infection really cannot sustain itself in the environment and it will go away eventually. If it's over 1, it's going to stay and going to increase. And the calculations for COVID-19 suggest that it is right around 3. So that means on average, every case of COVID-19 is going to infect or cause 3 other cases on average. That's in comparison to a number of just below 2 for the great influenza, for the Spanish flu, and seasonal influenza is even lower. Seasonal influenza is generally around 1.25 to 1.5. So this is a highly transmissible disease, and that's probably in part because it's a new virus in humans, and so everybody is immunologically naive. You know, influenza circulates yearly. We have some degree of cross-reacting protection to various strains, but this germ is completely new to our species, and so we are unprotected.
So in other words, nobody has any built-in immunity to it like they would something else.
That is correct.
Okay, so what about mortality rates? Do we have enough information yet to know how lethal this virus is compared to, well, let's say the great Spanish flu from 100 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. And it's hard to know because we don't really know the total numbers of people who are getting infected yet. I think the best evidence are from closed systems, such as the Diamond Princess. And the Diamond Princess was a cruise ship that had about 712 individuals get infected on that out of a total crew and population of a little bit over 3,000. So these folks were tested heavily. They came up with 712 individuals that were infected, and they've been followed over time, of course. And I believe the last time I looked, 12 of those 712 had died. So it gives you a mortality rate of about 1.5%. in that type of a scenario. If you look at influenza, seasonal flu is probably about 50 to 100 times less deadly than that.
I see.
Another way to look at this is you just simply look at hospitalizations and what % of hospitalized folks die. And that's a little bit more approachable because you know exactly how many people are hospitalized with the infection because that's how we're testing. And it's interesting that you asked that question because I was just looking at the numbers of that for the state of Oklahoma for this year. And what they show is that for the 2019-2020 influenza season, there were 3,448 hospitalizations due to influenza in Oklahoma with 83 deaths. So that's a crude case fatality rate of 2.4% of hospitalized individuals. Now this is compared to COVID-19 in Oklahoma, which so far there have been 428 hospitalizations and 88 deaths. So a crude case fatality rate of just under 21%. So it's almost 10 times more, has a higher case fatality rate of almost 10 times what hospitalized influenza does. And one of the big differences is that influenza season started back in September, whereas our first case of COVID-19 was just identified March 6th. So COVID is going faster in the population and really does have a much higher case fatality rate.
All right, well, your reference to Oklahoma is a perfect segue to my next question. I'd like to know what your primary duties are in the state of Oklahoma with regard to the pandemic.
So I've been doing a variety of things. I'm sort of like a decathlete or a utility infielder in this respect. So at the university, I'm the chief of infectious diseases at the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center. Specifically with COVID-19, I've been involved in our campus preparedness plans, putting them together several years ago and then executing them now. And so I'm part of two different committees. One is called the Emergency Operating Committee. The other one is called the Special Pathogens Preparedness and Operations Team. And my niche in those two committees is I'm the subject matter expert. So I have meetings every day, sometimes multiple meetings. My job is to educate folks on the newest information about this pathogen and then to give advice from my infectious diseases clinical knowledge about how to control infection, how to mitigate infection, how to deal with various policies. So it's this committee that's been involved in advising the university president on like what do we do with students? Should we bring them back after spring break? And very early on, we were counseling, don't bring the students back after spring break. And this includes the students on the health sciences campus as well as the Norman campus and all the OU campuses. And then in that capacity, I've also been doing an awful lot of public speaking and media spots for the university to talk about what to do and try to get the best information out to folks.
So is it fair to say that you're the chief spokesman then with regard to the University of Oklahoma on COVID-19?
I guess I would be one of them. There's a couple of us who have fulfilled that role. There's another gentleman who is our chief quality officer who's done an awful lot of the speaking as well.
Now, let me ask you a question with regard to students, college students and grad students. Looking back now with what's transpired since spring break, do you believe you all made the right decision?
Absolutely, we did. I think it was not going to be popular, but we knew that going into it. And, you know, fortunately, I've been able to work with some really good epidemiologists, PhD epidemiologists, one of whom is now our interim state epidemiologist, and the other gentleman is the dean of our College of Public Health. So they bring a whole different set of skills and expertise to this conversation. I bring the clinical aspect, they bring more mathematical modeling and epidemiology expertise, and so it really makes a great team. And between the three of us, I think we were able to come up with some very good and I won't say prescient, but I will say prescient policies. Many of our policies were in place before CDC, before the federal government. And by and large, they've turned out to be 1 to 2 weeks ahead of the time. So, and I think that's also helped control things locally.
Well, that's probably something your parents taught, similar to what my parents taught. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Absolutely, yeah.
So looking back, and I realize you've been very busy doing this work, but at what point, if you can remember, did you first become concerned that that this COVID-19 was going to be a bad event globally? I mean, can you point to a certain point in time that you thought, oh, this is not business as usual. This is not going to be a bust like some of these other things?
Yes, I can. And it was, I believe it was in late February. You know, we had been meeting for over a month in a variety of capacities, but the disease was in the US only in very limited amounts. And I thought, okay, we're going to get through this without any big deal. And as times changed over the next couple of weeks, I was preparing for a lecture that I gave the middle of March. And I remember preparing for that. I normally try to inject humor into my talks. And I was planning on starting out with an album cover from the 70s by Alice Cooper called Welcome to My Nightmare.
Yes.
And I've used that before in talks, and the residents love it, because then I get to show pictures of Alice Cooper and explain, you know, music from the 70s.
Right.
And I remember as I was preparing this lecture, and it was going to be live streamed, first of all, I was on a congressional roundtable with one of our local Congress members, and then it was the next week I was doing a grand rounds that was going to be live streamed. I just thought, you know, there's nothing funny about this. Mm-hmm. And it really struck me, and it has been a weight on me ever since, that this is not something that you can take lightly. It is changing our lives, and it is going to have probably the same or more impact. It will definitely have more impact than 9/11 did on us. In the same way that 9/11 changed the way we travel, COVID-19 is going to change so many other things. It's going to be very far-reaching.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think we don't really know the extent of the changes, especially the unintended changes. I mean, some you can predict, such as probably more people will be using Zoom technology and similar virtual, you know, meetings, but other things are just not knowable at this point. Some good, some bad. But I'm looking forward to when this is over and the historians start weighing in.
Yeah.
So, and this is a very broad question, and you might want to divvy this up, but just based on your experience, Dr. Drevets, how would you rate the response to COVID-19 in the United States? We'll say governmentally and institutionally.
So this is interesting, and this will be autopsied for years. So if you look at our governmental response, it has been clunky, to say the best. And it started out with nothing short of a debacle at the Centers for Disease Control with their testing capabilities. I still don't know exactly what went wrong with their initial testing kits, but about a third of the initial test kits that they sent out were flawed. And in fact, the group that we had here in Oklahoma were flawed. So you put that, and you also put it in the sense that they sent out inadequate numbers of tests. A third of them were lousy. Their testing strategy then was all shaped around the fact that, gee, we don't have enough tests, so we have to have a narrow testing strategy, when exactly the opposite was needed. And I'll compare this to the response in South Korea. And what they did when they had, I think it was even before they had the first case in South Korea, their head of, I believe it was the head of their CDC, got together with a variety of folks in their biotech industry and said, we need testing and we need it yesterday, essentially. And very rapidly, they engaged all sorts of the private sector as well as the public sector in testing huge numbers of people. And they were able to identify folks early, quarantine folks, and control their epidemic. By comparison, ours, we had enough lead time, but ours got away from us. What's fascinating, and I haven't checked on this, but I think the first cases of COVID-19 happened in the US and in South Korea at about the same day.
Interesting.
But the response has been completely different. Now, how we got here is another story, and it has to do with the fact that the CDC, the US CDC, has been the global standard for infectious disease testing. So no flies on the CDC. Something went wrong this time, and that will be figured out eventually. So I think everybody was correct to rely on the CDC because they are literally the gold standard, the world standard.
Right.
The other thing that plays into this is a structure that we have with the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And the FDA is designed to make sure that we know exactly what we get and that we can quantify it. And for a test, the FDA has to sign off on every medical test that's developed. And you have to know exactly the sensitivity, the specificity, the true predictive power, and the false predictive power. So without knowing those, you don't know what kind of a test you have. So the FDA does its job very well. Unfortunately, it takes time. And what we have found with this pandemic is that these structures that work great under ordinary circumstances can have flaws that are exacerbated and turn into huge cracks when there's a rapidly moving pandemic.
Right.
So that would be one of the key takeaways. Another takeaway for me in the governmental response is I really have grown in my admiration for Dr. Tony Fauci.
Yes.
He has been the chief of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since the 1990s, and he was a star then in the 90s when I was in my research training, and he has just become a superstar now. And I believe he's, 78, 79 years old.
He's 79, yes.
And and he's just an intellectual giant and full of integrity. So I've also watched some of the newscasts coming out of DC, and I think the experts do a great job. Others, perhaps it's a little spottier.
That's a very, very diplomatic way of putting it. And I know I've watched some of your other interviews, and I've seen you make your great comment about predicting things in the future. So I want to ask you that, but I will ask you about projections. Do you have any sense or any projections regarding when the rates of infection will flatten, either as a nation or, hotspots like New York? Is there enough information yet for you to make a projection?
Yes. So, and I was just looking at the New York City data today, and I was preparing a report for our emergency operating committee. And it looks like new cases in New York City are finally starting to go down. Now, that is early, and of course, I don't know what the reporting lag is in New York City between when the laboratory identifies the case and by the time it makes it up to the website. So on Monday, I could be proved wrong, but I believe there is early data in New York City that their cases of new infections are starting to go down. And you have to realize that every time you diagnose a new infection, you're finding somebody that was infected on average 5 to 7 days ago. And on average, they may not go to the hospital for another 4 to 6 days. And then on average, they'll be in the hospital for 9-ish days or so. And then if they're going to die, they die in about 9 days. So new cases will start to go down first. Hospitalizations will continue to increase, and then they will start going down. Death rates will come down last. And so we'll see how it goes.
Is it fair to say, though, that those infected that go to the hospital really represent the tip of the iceberg, because most people who get it will not need to go to the hospital?
That is exactly right. Most people who get it will not need to go to the hospital. And if you believe this data that we only detect anywhere from 6 to 16% of cases, the vast majority of people may not even know they're infected. So,
wow, that's really remarkable. I'm wondering if you have any other tips to add besides the oft-repeated admonition to wash your hands frequently, avoid touching your face, and stay more than 6 feet away from people you don't live with. Is there anything else that you want to add to that?
I think what I would say is that you keep calm, you look at the data as best you can, and you still have to act. Interestingly, 6 feet may not be far enough. There are data that suggest that when we cough or sneeze, they're come up with different kinds of models for this vortex that comes out as opposed to just aerosol and droplets, and things might be projected further. The other thing that this whole pandemic has taught me is that, sometimes the authorities get things wrong, and that's not throwing stones at them. It's just we're fallible creatures, and our systems are fallible, and sometimes they will fail. And so you always have to be looking at the information yourself and making the best judgments that you can. One of my colleagues in public health was very good about being strong in that way and kept saying we have to take the CDC recommendations as the floor for our recommendations as opposed to the ceiling. And I'll always remember that.
That's really, really great advice. Just got a few more questions. These are more in the personal versus professional, but as you mentioned, you are a Wheaton grad. I'm wondering how your Christian faith affects your duties as Oklahoma's leading infectious disease doctor.
So Christian faith affects that in a couple of ways. First of all, it affects you by keeping you humble and realizing that everything that you have has been given to you, even the things that you think you've worked very, very hard for. It's all a gift from above. So it's remembering there's a sense of humility there. The other thing that's really been on the forefront of my mind is in these media interviews. I was reading in the book of John when Jesus was discussing with the Pharisees his credentials. And he talked about how one who is sent is trying to bring glory to the one who sent him, as opposed to bringing honor to himself. And I've really tried to take that tack that I'm not doing these interviews, doing the media spots to honor myself. I'm trying to honor the one who sent me. And I do that best by just sticking to the facts and giving away interviews to people who I think can do it better than I can. So there's a lot of humility there, and just asking for grace and wisdom every day to get through each day and do it the best that I can.
Well, those are wise words. Any scriptures, any verses that brought you comfort during this stressful pandemic season?
Yes, but I can't exactly remember what they are off the top of my head.
That's fair.
But what I've been doing this month is I've been reading through the book of John in the Message, using the Message version, and I'm just constantly impressed by the poignancy of Christ's words when he's questioned. And I think the verse that really does ring a bell to me is one talking about how Jesus talks about how, the one who's sent seeks to honor the one who sent him.
Right.
And for me, that's the ticket.
Got it. So I've asked you professional questions, personal questions. Is there any question that I should have asked you that you'd like to answer?
So one question is, I guess two questions. One is, did I ever think this would happen? And the answer is no. I just never thought this would happen in my lifetime. I've read about the Spanish influenza, I've lectured on it, but I just never thought we would see something to this degree. The next question is, when do I think another one of these will occur? And that's an interesting question. SARS, which is a highly related virus to this virus, had its heyday about 20 years ago. And then about 5 years later, MERS came out, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome. So I would say that probably every decade, we're going to have some kind of a new either coronavirus or some kind of a new viral pathogen that is going to disrupt our lives to a greater or a lesser extent. And we need to be prepared. And this is going to change the way that we do medicine. As you know, medical systems in the US have been streamlined for efficiency and to cut costs, as well as to see people. Preparedness requires redundancy, and redundant systems are expensive to maintain.
Yes.
I don't know how we're going to do that, but we need to figure out how to have redundant systems, how to strengthen our systems. We cannot get into a bind where we're running out of things such as masks and gowns anymore. I mean, this just cannot happen again. I never thought I would see it happen in the US. I never thought that I would have to make policies in the hospital and on the university based on the fact that we only have 100 swabs a day that we can use. And then when we run out of swabs, or if we had enough swabs, we don't have enough PCR extraction reagents. And if we had enough extraction reagents, we'd run out of something else. It's just been incredible.
Right.
So those
it sounds like this is a wake-up call to a lot of sectors, not just the government, but also medicine in the United States.
Yeah, and these are, the changes are going to affect manufacturing, they're going to affect politics, it's going to have clear economic repercussions. So your center is going to see these things happen and is going to touch, many of these changes are going to touch and intersect with your center.
Well, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your service to your community and our community writ large during this time of great need. And this is Good Friday. So as Christians, I hope we can still maintain our joy because we know that ultimately there will be victory over death. So thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure. And I look forward to greeting you on Sunday morning by saying, He is risen.
Amen.
You've been listening to a podcast from the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. You can find us at wheaton.edu/FP.